Welcome to the series of Driftaway Tales. Chapter 1. The Harvest Gala. Marleycombe dressed itself for virtue. By noon the village green shone with bunting and trestle tables. Brass music battled a September wind. Cakes were ranked like a small army of good intentions. Under the chestnuts, Mrs. Penelope Ryves ran the Harvest Charity Gala with a ledger, a cash box, and the air of a woman who believed efficiency a moral act. Miss Jane Marple, shawl soft as dove's feathers, watched from the shade, unassuming and attentive, as one who had learned that the secret of seeing is not to be noticed seeing. The afternoon's ornament was Eleanor Whitcombe of the Beeches, cool, exact, formidable in dove gray with a rose at her shoulder. She could remember which chair had returned, scuffed from last spring's lecture, and who had scuffed it. Today, she had agreed to preside over the raffle, a silver dish of numbered stubs at her hand, a glass bowl for drawing beneath the calmly indifferent church clock. The sum announced, £57, 2 shillings and 9 pence, pleased the village. It pleased Mrs. Ryves's ledger more. Eleanor paused briefly to glance left towards the jam stall, a flicker of attention a polite crowd would ignore. She lifted a folded paper and checked it with interest rather than calculation, as though reading something unanticipated. A choir girl, Kitty Pike, bright shoes, bright hair, hurried up with a cut glass bottle of sal volatile, a committee's small courtesy for the wind. Eleanor dabbed her handkerchief, inhaled, and the village's gaiety altered in an instant. Stiffness first, a bowl ringing as it tipped, then a collapse that was not faintness, but an end. Faces widened into the helplessness of witnesses. The brass fell away into silence. Miss Marple did not push forward. She stepped, without heat or haste, to the shadow beside the dais. Kitty hovered, stricken, the bottle held delicately from her body. Miss Marple noted the new cork, the chip on the stopper, a pale ring at the neck, neither sticky nor dry, more like resin than oil. She did not sniff. Resin summoned other thoughts. Fishing rods mended in parlors, cheap tobacco kept in sheds. Inspector Graves appeared as inspectors do, without drama, wholly expected. A tall, practical man, he surveyed the fallen bowl and the stillness on the dais. Dr. Leonard was away in Torquay, the vicar croaked, and the crowd gave the small human sound of people who have been deprived of the right helper at the wrong time. Graves kept them back, sent for a screen, declined to touch the bottle, and let the vestry swallow the silent figure of Eleanor Whitcombe. Life, affronted, attempted to continue. The brass tried a hymn and abandoned it after 4 bars. Cakes sold. People prefer tasks with names when frightened. Miss Marple, who preferred observation to bustle, drifted towards the righted raffle bowl. The numbers lay in disarray. She saw 215, 216, 219. She remembered 217, written in a blunt pencil, pressed hard. It was not there. Tickets are often overlooked, of course, but memory is a precise creature when something in it is caught. The clues, Miss Marple allowed herself the word, arranged themselves without asking permission. The new cork, the stain at the stopper, the yellow smear at the lace edge of the fallen handkerchief, the missing ticket in a heavier hand, the earlier glance to the left of the dais at the jam stall where Bernard Vale now stood, with the careful ease of a man who knows both money and the need to look as if he isn't thinking about it. Vale had been a boy from the mill once. London and a good marriage had taught him to wear his suits thin and his expression appropriate. The story of the bottle came in small, nervous pieces. Mrs. Ryves kept tonics in her cupboard. Kitty had been sent to fetch the salts. The bottle had been cleaned very nicely by her Uncle George Pike, who worked at the nursery and liked things bright. There had also been, as Kitty remembered once prompted by an ordinary question, a second bottle in that cupboard, the gardener's wash for greenfly, labeled by Mr. Crane with skulls that upset the twins. Mrs. Ryves had removed the frightening label for decency's sake. Everything was properly marked, she said. Kitty's eyes said otherwise. Inspector Graves took names as one might take measurements and promised himself the bottle would be examined. He noted, too, the paper Eleanor had lifted. A list, Mrs. Ryves asserted briskly, the total of donations in her hand. Miss Marple thought of how people hold lists and how they hold unexpected notes. The gesture had been of interest, not accounting. When the vestry door opened, Vicar Bloom's face had the settled look of a man who had used the bigger words. The village felt, at last, the blunt fact. A woman in command of things was no longer there to command them. Men took down bunting with shy care, as if noise might be an offense. Mr. Crane approached Miss Marple with his cap in his hands and an anxiety in his manner. No artifice there. The twins, he explained, were inquisitive. The nasty bottle ought to be fetched. Miss Marple, kind but immovable, preferred the inspector's sanction. Mr. Crane retreated, relieved to have been civil and excused from more. Miss Marple walked home when the green had turned into flattened rectangles of grass, and the weather, which never concerns itself with human programs, began to cool. Her cottage accepted her with the quiet certainty of teapot and chair. She poured tea, half a spoon of sugar, milk to the pallor she liked. She did not enjoy thinking ill of people. The habit of St. Mary Mead and of Marleycombe is to assume that most sins are small and most offenders ordinary. Yet a new cork had been shaved to fit an old neck. A stopper's rim remembered resin. Lace had caught a dusting of yellow that was not pollen one would expect in September. A raffle ticket in a heavy hand had gone missing. And somewhere between the jam stall and the dais, a glance had carried more meaning than courtesy. She considered accident and misadventure. Ladies faint at fate, salts restore them. Ladies do not, as a rule, die from courtesy bottles. There were, of course, suicides. Villages know something of despair. But Eleanor Whitcombe had not prepared herself for death in public, nor chosen a method that left hands unclean, but other hands very clean indeed. If misadventure, then a chain of foolishness. Labels removed to spare children, bottles cleaned past usefulness, tonics and poisons kept neighborly in a cupboard, a girl sent in a hurry. Yet Eleanor's brief, unmistakable expression, first surprise, then fear, did not belong to a woman unluckily overcome. It belonged to someone who had recognized, in the last beat of time, that a small, tidy act had been prepared for her. Inspector Graves would send for tests and telegram Torquay. He would collect gossip, which would come willingly and in bulk. He would be methodical and patient and, in the end, effective. Miss Marple did not doubt his competence. She merely knew its limits. Villages are made not only of facts but of habits. Who borrows chairs? Who disapproves of skulls on bottles? Who cleans glass nicely? Who looks across a raffle table when a certain name is spoken? She set down her cup. The room, warm with late light, offered no drama, only the consolations of order. Books straight on their shelves, a small mending basket, a geranium that refused to admit the season was turning. Miss Marple, who disliked untidiness in drawers and in conclusions, allowed herself one clean sentence, spoken into the quiet like the closing stitch on a row of knitting. It was murder. And somebody in Marleycombe, somebody convinced that neatness is the same thing as cleverness, had been very tidy indeed. Chapter 2. The village takes sides. Marleycombe woke to a new air, thinned and brittle, as if the wind had scoured away a layer of innocence during the night. People lowered their voices without quite knowing why. Curtains stirred earlier than usual. Milk was brought in with the delicacy of letters carrying bad news. On the green, faint rectangles of pressed grass marked where tables had stood, like the memory of a conversation one would rather not repeat. The bunting had gone back to its wooden box. The day had no decorations left to put on. Inspector Graves set his method across the village like a neat tablecloth. The bottle, stoppered and wrapped, departed by motor for the county laboratory. Statements arranged themselves in lines. The vestry took on the temperature of a waiting room between one truth and another. By 10, every respectable house had arranged to be found respectable. By 10:30, gossip had agreed to be called concern. Miss Marple made calls, because that is what one does when something appalling and particular has happened. The old custom of presents, tea, and a little practical remark will go further than condolence sent by messenger. She took with her a crochet bag and the reliable air of a woman whose visits never oblige a second cup. At the beeches, the blinds were lowered to half-mast, the garden as clipped as ever, the roses dutifully bright. A maid with a blotched face opened the door and then left Miss Marple with a silver photograph frame of Eleanor as a younger woman looking at nothing, and the sense of a house that had mislaid its voice. A companion, Miss Agnes Hart, a precise, pale creature whose clothing had learned not to creak, appeared from the doorway with the careful movements of someone unsure which of her habits had just been judged. There were arrangements to be made. There was a brother to be telegraphed in Bristol. There was the solicitor, Mr. Hobday, who disliked surprises. On a side table, a bowl held a single late nasturtium like a brave button. Miss Marple noticed the absence of what should have been present. No smelling salts, no household tonic, nothing faintly medicinal to justify a sudden weakness. Eleanor Whitcombe had supervised health as she supervised everything else. She had not, Miss Marple thought, been preparing to fall. She went on to Mrs. Penelope Ryves, whose neat square of a drawing-room smelled of lavender and duty. The ledger sat on a side table as if it had been promoted to honorary family. Mrs. Ryves had done her grieving in the economical way of efficient women, and now held herself like a list balanced under the hand. She had already telephoned the vicar to offer black armbands for the choir, and the Mothers' Union had approved a wreath in the shape of a harp. There was talk of suspending the raffle until appropriate. Miss Marple let it pass. That cupboard, yes, the one by the pantry, had been tidied that morning, labels straightened, glassware properly ranked. Mr. Crane's alarming sketches of skulls had been retrieved from the scullery drawer and clipped, repentant, back onto his bottles. Kitty Pike's name flickered in Mrs. Ryves's sentences like a candle in a draught. The woman's mouth pinched unconsciously at the edges when she said it. Miss Marple, who had seen small fires of resentment sputter for decades, marked the pinch and stored it. At the nursery yard, the air smelt convincingly of loam and the clean fatigue of honest work. George Pike stood with his sleeves rolled and his pride laid out in rows of scrubbed pots. He demonstrated, without being asked, his method with glass. A little soda, a little vinegar. A cloth worked to a soft fret. The way to turn old things clear. His hands were large, heavier in the fingers than the palms. Writing, Miss Marple thought, would be deep in the paper when he did it. He claimed no chemist's art and no curiosity about cupboards beyond keeping them shining. He offered, shyly, condolences for Kitty's fright, for Mrs. Ryves's agitation, for the way things sometimes go wrong when one is trying to help. His anxiety was the sort that wishes to have been better, not the sort that hopes one is not found out. Mr. Crane, narrower and browner, showed Miss Marple his greenhouse with the gravity of a man introducing a chapel. There were indeed bottles. There was indeed a wash for greenfly, nicotine and soap, the old gardener's remedy he preferred to the modern acids and powders. He described almost proudly the label he had drawn so the boys would not mistake it: large bones, a grin, a pair of crossovers. He did not enjoy that his art had been deemed unsuitable for a pantry. He said nothing against Mrs. Ryves. His silence nevertheless had a patient sting to it, as if he had taught people precautions, and they had put flowers on the notices. The vicarage gave Miss Marple a different sort of quiet, one made of paper and hesitation. Ezra Bloom looked thinner in sunshine. Guilt had stretched him in a night. He had sent telegrams with a small, steady hand. He had composed a notice for the parish sheet that said everything and nothing. He had thought, poor man, about the doctrine of Providence, and then put the thought away as unfitting for a Tuesday. On his desk, under a paperweight, lay the auction list for the charity silver, with neat sums against lots, and the approving initials of Bernard Vale. Miss Marple read without reading: Tray, Porringer, Cruet, a parish of objects hoping not to be pawned. She did not need to be told that Eleanor Whitcombe had been the sort of woman who preferred approval to generosity and made generosity respectable by making it arithmetical. By afternoon, the village had found a number to whisper: 217. It traveled from gate to gate, as missing things do, chiefly because a number allows even the least informed to feel a little in the know. Someone had remembered the ticket under the righted bowl. Someone had noticed it was not included in the vicar's careful pile. Someone had suggested, with the importance of discovery, that the winning claim might be sought. The prize had been a hamper. Hamper prizes breed talk, and so 217 became a kind of password to the day's discomfort. Miss Marple did not discourage the talk. She watched how it ran. Bernard Vale made himself available to be seen, which is a banker's truest currency. He stood in the doorway of the bank as if sunlight were immoral and watched the high street with the tastefully grave expression that makes depositors feel they have placed their worries into a velvet-lined box. He had approved the reserve prices for the silver, as he had approved interest on a small loan for the relief fund to cover the new roof of the school. He had been photographed at last year's dedication, moderately central and lightly smiling. He nodded to Miss Marple with the acknowledgment due to a lady of standing and the curiosity due to a lady who sees. His cuffs were immaculate. His shoes had learned not to squeak. His face carried nothing a sensible jury would call a lie. Miss Marple, who had no jury to satisfy, noticed a faint gloss of varnish at the stitch of his walking stick where a scratch had been filled. Word of the bottle went out and came back as opinion. It had smelt of salts. It had smelt of hospitals. It had smelt, one insistent voice claimed, of cigarettes in the evening when the boys loitered by the mill. Miss Marple, who owned a nephew with a fondness for experiments and a gardener with a fondness for old remedies, did not find contradiction in these reports. Nicotine had a way of speaking through other scents, a sly thread under stronger perfumes. She had once seen a geranium droop and recover under an overgenerous hand. The memory rose now like a label rubbed clean but readable under light. Near dusk, a small incident pretended to be small and failed. The pantry door at Mrs. Ryves's sprang and would not shut. The catch, recently convinced of its own reliability, had strained. In the scullery a cloth had darkened in a round, as if a bottle's damp bottom had rested there minutes before. Kitty Pike, sent on an errand she could not quite remember when asked, returned with cheeks too pink, and attempted, valiantly, to remember whether she had taken nothing and then put back the nothing she had not taken. Mrs. Ryves's pinched mouth became a stitch. The constable, called in a spirit of caution, reported that nothing had been removed. Miss Marple, who had seen many nothings behave noisily, made a note. She went home by the longer lane because the hedgerows there keep confidences, and because time between places is when thoughts sort themselves without being asked. The evening had begun to taste of wood smoke. The fields kept their color longer at the horizon. It is easier to be just in the half-light. She thought of Mrs. Whitcomb's brief surprise, of a new cork shaved and set, of a stopper's rim with a faint varnish slick, of a lace edge stained the color of old straw, of a number pressed hard on a ticket and then gone walking. She thought, too, of the way villagers tidy danger until it fits decency, labels removed so as not to alarm, arrangements made so as not to offend, cupboards put right as if safety could be curated. Her cottage waited with its lamp ready. The hall smelled comfortingly of beeswax and the faintly damp wool of her shawl. On the mat a plain envelope lay, the unremarkable kind the postmistress sells by the dozen. There had been no post, the hour was wrong for it. Someone had used the letter slot as if it were a whisper. Inside, under the simplest folded paper, lay a raffle ticket, 217. The pencil marks were heavy and dulled at the edges, the pressure unmistakable. The corner bore a faint yellow bruise and a fingerprint blurred into a crescent by haste. No note accompanied it, no assertion, no plea, only on the back in a hand that had tried to be smaller than it was. A single word written as if the writer did not trust the word to behave. Forgive. Miss Marple stood very still, the envelope shadowing her hand. Outside, a late tram of rooks argued about their tree and then settled. Inside, the clock in the parlor chose that moment to sound the hour as if to mark a chapter's end. Forgiveness, she thought, is often requested by those who have done something they know how to name. This, however, smelt of fear rather than repentance. It suggested someone who had been used or had used themselves in the service of another's tidy plan, and had now, lacking the courage for confession, performed the smaller bravery of putting one thing back. She put the ticket in her workbox among reels and needles, as one stores a dangerous pin until it can be employed safely. The village, she knew, would sleep badly. She suspected one house would not sleep at all. Somewhere between the bank and the pantry, between the nursery yard and the vicar's desk, someone had decided that neatness could be a weapon. The second incident had arrived, folded and ordinary. The next would not come through a letter slot. Chapter 3. The note that wasn't mourning put a thin shine on Marleycombe and found no comfort there. The green had recovered its innocent color but not its ease. By 9, the vestry smelled of paper and damp wool. By 10, a boy on a bicycle skidded up the lane with a telegram, and Inspector Graves read what everyone had already suspected in their private minds. The contents of the cut glass bottle were not harmless. Nicotine, old gardener's strength, not the polite hospital sting of sal volatile. A poison picked for tidiness. It carries other scents on its back and leaves almost nothing behind if one has washed the glass properly. The inspector set the telegram beneath a paperweight as if pinning a moth. He called for bottles, for corks, for any wash Mr. Crane might keep at the nursery. He sent a note to Torquay to meet Dr. Leonard's train. He arranged statements into piles as a man sets bricks, weight distributed, corners square. The village watched his competence with relief and supplied him with certainty and error in equal measure. Miss Marple preferred to begin where noise was thinnest. The post office kept a ledger of its own kind. Small talk turned to ink by habit and a counter polished by coins and elbows. On the shelf behind the postmistress stood envelopes like the one that had slid through Miss Marple's door. The woman shook her head at questions about late deliveries. No post had gone out after tea. Someone had used the slot no later than 6:30. A boy, Freddie Hobson, in shoes he was outgrowing by the hour, had loitered outside after choir practice and reported, unasked, a person in a dark coat lingering by Miss Marple's hedge at just that time. Boys reported details in the order of their interest. The coat had smelt of varnish. The shoes were good. The walker used a stick that tapped neat and quick on the path. No name offered, none needed. Men who run banks teach their sticks to behave. She walked on. The brass quartet's youngest, Ernie Fellows, cheeks still round from childhood, polished his cornet by his mother's gate. He had been near the dais when Eleanor Whitcombe mounted it. He had seen, as musicians do, what others miss while looking at the main event. A folded paper had been on the raffle table, not in Mrs. Ryves's hand, creased as if folded too hard, and then smoothed. It had arrived moments before the sum was read, slid from the left side by a neat hand that did not hover. The hand had belonged, Ernie thought, to a man with a silver cufflink shaped like a shield. He remembered the shine because the sun had found it, and because boys notice armor on men. Miss Marple thanked him with a nod he would tell his mother about. She kept walking, and her thoughts arranged themselves into their own tidy rows. A banker's stick, a cufflink, a folded paper that behaved more like news than a list. The varnish sent again, threading back to yesterday's faint ring on the stopper, that slickness at the neck of glass that had not been oil. Varnish attends habits, old furniture, boating varnish on a dinghy, repairs done by men who prefer the smell of neatness to the sight of work unfinished. It clung to Bernard Vale's person as cologne might to others. At the beaches, blinds were still lowered and carpets absorbed footsteps. Miss Agnes Hart presided in a small way over the stationer's tasks of grief. Envelopes set out, black-edged paper, a pen with a prudent nib. On Eleanor's writing desk lay yesterday's correspondence tied with the sort of string that makes a person feel she has not been extravagant. The topmost envelope carried an embossed crest from Vale and District Bank and a single line in the lower corner. Urgent, kind attention. Miss Marple did not disturb it. She did not need to. This was the bank's handwriting, not Bernard's, perhaps, but his house style. On a chair by the window, a cardigan had been left with a brooch pinned carefully to it. Under the brooch, a faint narrow thread of pale residue marked the wool where someone had brushed against a shelf unwisely. Nicotine washes leave a trace on knits that the laundry notices and cannot name. Agnes Hart, precise in her sorrow, offered the bare shape of the previous day. Eleanor had been in excellent spirits before the gala, satisfied that accounts would be approved, determined that certain items in the silver auction fetch what she considered appropriate. The woman had disliked bargains as a principle. She had written 2 notes before leaving, one to Mr. Hobday, solicitor, one to Vicar Bloom. Polite things, Agnes believed, about raffle lists and the order of speeches. The desk tray showed a third scrap, its top edge torn cleanly, as if a note had been lifted away by fingers intending to return it, then thinking better. Miss Marple left the house in its careful grief and crossed to the vicarage. Ezra Bloom had dark smudges under his eyes that made him look more earnest and less certain. The auction list remained. The reels inside were arranged with a stranger's idea of order. The envelope containing 217 rested under the false bottom she used for old letters, precisely where she had placed it. Only now the flap had been lifted and smoothed again with a finger that did not care for paper. On the table by the window, a faint crescent of grease marked where a hand had steadied itself. Varnish left a whisper in the air that could have belonged to furniture polish or to a stick. She closed the box and sat very still. The third event had arrived. Small, quiet, unmistakable. Someone had come looking not for money or jewels, but for a number written bluntly in pencil, for a proof that might be mistaken for something else. The village would say, by nightfall, that Inspector Graves had the matter in hand. Miss Marple knew a different thing, that the hand which had reached into her workbox belonged to a mind convinced that neatness is safety. It is not. It is only the trail a tidy person cannot help leaving when they believe they have tidied everything. Chapter 4. The gardener's secret dawn came hesitantly to Marleycombe, laying a dull gray over rooftops still heavy with unease. Rumor had found a rhythm. By morning, villagers spoke in careful tones. Inspector Graves, they said, was closing in. He was not. He had fragments of truth and not yet the shape of murder. But Miss Marple had begun to see the outline. Fear, she often said, left fingerprints, and someone in Marleycombe had very fearful hands. She walked at first light toward the village nursery. The mud told stories before people did. A single heavy-footed set of tracks, not Crane's familiar step, nor Vale's polished tread. George Pike, yes, that matched. A strong man loyal enough to follow orders he did not understand. She found Mr. Crane already at work among the greenhouse frames, pruning with the steady patience of a man who had weathered life without expecting fairness from it. When Miss Marple greeted him, he nodded cautiously. "I passed George Pike on this lane last night," she said mildly, running a finger along a potting bench dusted with fine resin. "He was in a hurry." Crane paused but didn't turn. "George does odd jobs in his own time. Meant no harm." "Harm isn't always intentional," Miss Marple said. "Sometimes it's requested." He stopped pruning. "If you're about to lay this at my door, don't. I warned Mrs. Ryves about that pantry cupboard. Garden wash and smelling salts don't belong side by side." "You mentioned varnish," Miss Marple replied, examining a faint sticky sheen on the bench. "The same varnish used on a bottle someone tried to clean." Crane gave a weary exhale. "George brought varnish here last week. Thought he was tidying. That lad tidies until nothing makes sense. He strips labels off bottles, throws away corks because they look old. Doesn't understand that old things tell you what they are." "But he didn't replace the poisoned bottle," Miss Marple said. "No," Crane agreed. "George isn't neat enough to be a killer. Someone else sent him." She turned to him fully. "And why was he in Mrs. Ryves's pantry, after Eleanor Whitcombe was already dead?" Crane looked at her a long moment, then answered quietly. "Because he was sent." Inspector Graves listened grimly as Miss Marple relayed the conversation. The schoolhouse had become his command post. Maps, lists, and notes surrounding him like a siege. He opened Pike's original statement. Something was missing. Not lies, but omissions. When Pike was brought in, his strength seemed to collapse into fear. "I didn't do anything wrong," he whispered. "No one said you did," Miss Marple assured him. "But someone told you what to do." After a long, miserable pause, Pike nodded. "I was told to fetch a bottle from the pantry," he said. "Told which drawer." "Told not to ask questions." "By whom?" Graves asked. Pike's eyes shut. "Mr. Vale," he said. Bernard Vale arrived at the schoolhouse looking composed, his cane tapping lightly. He did not stay as calm. "I sent Pike for documents," he said. "Financial papers." "Nothing more." "You approved Pike's loan from the relief fund," Graves said. A loan he hasn't finished repaying. Vale's jaw tightened. Charity, Inspector, is not a crime. No, Miss Marple said softly, but charity can purchase obedience. Vale's eyes flicked to her. Are you accusing me? I don't accuse, Miss Marple said. I observe. And she had observed something very clearly. Someone in Marleycombe used loyalty the way other people use poison, quietly, invisibly, and only when necessary. And such people rarely stopped at one death. Chapter 5. Ashes in the greenhouse morning came low and colorless over Marleycombe, as though daylight regretted the errand before it. By 8 o'clock, the bell at St. Michael's tolled a single confused note, not calling to prayer, but to trouble. Inspector Graves stood in the vestry beside a window latch that had been neatly pried open. His boots wore a dull coat of churchyard mud, and he held a square of muslin between his fingers, careful not to disturb whatever remained. Very little had been left. The relief fund ledger was gone. So was the Mother's Union receipt book containing the raffle stubs. A drawer that had once held petty cash gaped open, untouched, as if to suggest honesty through theatrical restraint. On the stone sill lay a faint crescent of varnish smeared by a gloved thumb. The missing paperweight had been placed on the floor with almost comical courtesy, leaving a clean square of dust on the desk. Miss Marple arrived discreetly, accepted the vicar's flustered apologies for the damaged window, and began what she did best, looking. Real looking. The sort that notices absence as keenly as presence. Ledgers, once removed, leave a shape behind, an indentation no polish can hide. Her eyes drifted to the hymn board, 92, 300, 14, 67. The numbers seemed unremarkable until she saw the middle hymn card pushed slightly askew, a dull smear along its edge. Beeswax, touched by a fastidious hand. The same sheen marked the cupboard knob where choir candles were stored and the pried edge of the window. Tidy hands, she murmured. Inspector Graves noted her gaze. You see something? I see someone who doesn't like leaving untidy work behind. At 10 o'clock, a column of gray smoke rose from the direction of the nursery. Not the lazy plume of a bonfire. Too straight, too deliberate. The villagers drifted toward it under the pretext of concern. Miss Marple followed, unhurried. The greenhouse smelled acrid when she arrived, burned paraffin, and something bitter that stung the throat. Mr. Crane sat just outside, coughing into a cloth soaked in cold water. The paraffin heater under the potting bench had burned dangerously high. Above it, a shelf was scorched but intact. On the bench lay a jar turned on its side, a pool of nicotine wash bleeding across the wood. Crane recovered enough to speak. Greenhouse was fine half an hour ago, he said hoarsely. Then it turned on me. Wick didn't do that on its own. Miss Marple examined the heater from a distance. There was no soot where Crane's hands would normally grip, only a faint, wax-like shine on the adjuster. Inspector Graves arrived, already tired of the day. Accident? He asked. Not likely, Miss Marple said. That wick was set by someone who keeps beeswax nearby. And not in a greenhouse, Graves frowned. Same polish as the vestry? She nodded. Then she saw it, a thread caught on the rough edge of a shelf, black, ribbed. Not part of Crane's brown jacket or rough work clothes. Choir armbands had been handed out only yesterday. Black ribbon, ribbed, sewn by Mrs. Ryves. Crane followed her eyes, and his jaw set. George Pike was here last night, he muttered. Said he was sent. Sent by whom? Graves asked sharply, but Crane only shook his head. Someone tidy. Miss Marple glanced down. The soil on the greenhouse floor told its own quiet story. 2 sets of prints, Crane's broad, familiar treads, and another pair, lighter, narrower, almost elegant. The heel bore a nail-polished flat, the kind of shoe that walked carefully even in mud. By noon, Marleycombe was full of theories, each villager polishing their own preferred suspect. But Miss Marple preferred facts, and in her cottage that afternoon, she studied them one by one. Ticket 217, returned in an envelope with a precise hand, the varnish on the Pride vestry window, the polished heel print in the greenhouse. The number on the raffle ticket had been written with pressure, heavy hand, workman's grip, George Pike. But the envelope had been addressed in careful, educated script. Agnes Hart, perhaps. Or someone used to directing others quietly, someone like Bernard Vale. A knock came. Mr. Hobday's boy, with a letter. A copy of a memorandum Eleanor Whitcombe had filed the morning of the gala. No more relief fund disbursements without a second signature. Countersigned for receipt by an initial that might have been a V. Vale had been warned, and Eleanor had not lived another day. Miss Marple stepped outside later, passing by the bank. Bernard Vale stood framed in the doorway as if posing for respectability, though the polish on his cane's ferrule seemed newer than the wood it joined. He greeted her with civilized coolness. She responded with only politeness. That night, she laid her quiet trap, not to catch, but to observe. A harmless bottle place. Near a conveniently unlatched window, a test. Someone took the bait. At 9:30, a gloved hand reached in, paused, then retreated. The intruder left nothing, except a mark. The faint oval of a cufflink pressed into condensation. A crest with the tiniest nick. Miss Marple smiled without joy. Tidy men, she knew, never sleep well while loose ends still exist. And someone in Marleycombe was very tidy indeed. Chapter 6. Quiet Motives and Measured Lies. 500 words. Inspector Graves arrived at Miss Marple's cottage before 9, carrying the thoughtful frown of a man who had slept little and learned much. She gave him tea, not out of courtesy, but strategy. People reveal more when their hands are occupied. She placed a small square of card on the table. The visitor who came through my window last night left this behind. Graves examined the faint oval traced on the card. A cufflink mark, crested, nick on the edge. His eyes lifted. Bernard Vale. It fits him, Miss Marple agreed, though it doesn't yet prove murder. He may only have been tidying away what frightened him. Graves gave a flat smile. Or what incriminated him. Tidy people, said Miss Marple, often tidy evidence. He slipped the card into an envelope. Motive will decide it. And I think motive has begun to surface. Eleanor Whitcombe's funeral brought the whole village to St. Michael's. Not from affection, few had liked her, but because death is a mirror, and people come to see how they look in it. Bernard Vale sat 2 pews from the front, upright, polished, and profoundly alone. No one offered him condolences. Influence, Miss Marple reflected, peels away like varnish when cracked. Mrs. Ryves dabbed her eyes in brisk intervals, grief measured like housekeeping. George Pike, shoulders straining in a borrowed suit, looked terrified he might be asked for an opinion. Mr. Crane sat near the aisle like a weathered oak, silent, solid. Kitty Pike was absent, wisely sheltered by her aunt after the scandal of the bottle. But Dolly Hornbeam, village seamstress and silent observer, was there, watching with eyes that missed nothing. When the coffin descended, Agnes Hart, Eleanor's quiet companion, swayed. Her hands clutched her handbag as though something inside it had weight beyond its size, truth or guilt, perhaps both. Miss Marple watched her closely. Agnes Hart had the pallor of someone who had waited too long to speak. At the beaches afterward, conversation thickened into theory. People whispered with new certainty now that Bernard Vale was being quietly questioned by the police. Miss Marple did what she did best, listened without appearing to. Dolly Hornbeam approached her first without theatrics. "I saw something," she said simply. Miss Marple nodded. "The truth nearly always begins that way." "The day before the gala," Dolly said, "I delivered lace cuffs to Miss Hart. While I was there, Miss Whitcombe and Mr. Vale were quarreling. She said funds shouldn't be moved without record. Miss Hart tried to calm her. Mr. Vale said temporary adjustments were harmless. Miss Whitcombe didn't agree," Miss Marple said. "No," Dolly replied, eyes steady. And Miss Hart was afraid. Not for herself. For him, Miss Marple found Agnes Hart alone upstairs, folding handkerchiefs that did not need folding, a ritual to keep panic at bay. "Did you come to comfort or question?" Agnes asked without looking up. "Both," Miss Marple said. "You warned Eleanor about Bernard Vale." Agnes hesitated, then nodded. She trusted him. "I told her she was wrong," her voice cracked. "And now she's dead, and everyone thinks it was a fainting fit." "She wrote to Mr. Hobday," Miss Marple said gently, "about the missing fund money." Agnes closed her eyes. She wrote again. A second letter. "It's gone." "Taken?" "Yes." "By Vale?" Agnes did not answer. She did Bernard. Vale entered the parlor then, accepting condolences without wanting them. When he saw Miss Marple, he paused. In that moment, she understood. He no longer saw her as harmless. He saw her as a risk. He had influence. He had secrets. But somewhere nearby was someone even more dangerous, someone ruled not by loyalty or greed, but fear. And fear, Miss Marple knew, is the most efficient weapon in a murderer's hand. Chapter 7. An Arrest in Order. Inspector Graves liked cases that behaved on paper. By 9 the next morning he had one that seemed obedient. The lab matched the black ribbed thread from the greenhouse to the hastily sewn choir armbands. The soil at the nursery doorway held the same fine grit found by Mrs. Ryves's back gate. George Pike's statement showed fresh corrections, the heavy pencil biting through the sheet. When questioned, his fingers still bore a faint resin sheen. The relief fund ledger and stub book were missing. The vestry had been opened with tidy precision. People who make muddles, Graves thought, don't straighten hymn boards. At 11, he set the facts in a neat row on the vestry table. Pike. Access to cupboards, heavy hand for raffle tickets, a loan approved by Bernard Vale, gratitude that could be steered, presence near the pantry after the death, tracks to the nursery before dawn. A fool can be led into wickedness and told it was help. Pike did not resist. Standing in the schoolroom with his cap crushed in both hands, he heard the words that produced an arrest. He said only that he had done what he was told and meant no harm. Harmlessness is not a defense once a village wants the comfort of an ending. The constable led him away with the gentleness one uses for a man whose strength never learned where to go. Marleycombe exhaled. Sympathy arranged itself quickly. Poor Kitty, poor Mrs. Ryves, poor George, perhaps drink, perhaps ignorance. A tidy conclusion after untidy days. Miss Marple did not obstruct the conclusion. She watered her geranium, removed 2 offending leaves, and walked the path gossip had not taken. By the yew where fine souls had pressed the earth. Past the bank steps scrubbed after the funeral. By the beeches, where a blind now sat properly lowered. Back to the nursery where the air had finally turned clean. Tidiness is not innocence, she thought. Only habit. Graves joined her, triumph drained from his face. "It holds," he said. "It does," Miss Marple replied, "and yet it is insufficient." "Heavy hands don't make clever substitutions," she added. "Whoever swapped the stopper and pinned that greenhouse door likes to save the furniture while committing the burglary." "Vale," Graves said. "Possibly. But the ribbon thread says someone who handled choir things moved here. Mrs. Ryves can remove an armband at 10 paces. Plenty of motives," he muttered. "More motives than suspects," she said. "That is worse." That afternoon the village settled into relief. Agnes Hart moved like a detached shadow. Mrs. Ryves, braced by righteousness, organized broths for Kitty. Mr. Crane worked with the steady fury of a man who prefers labor to talk. In the bank doorway, Vale's calm looked suddenly brittle. Graves received an anonymous parcel. April's relief fund ledger pages copied in a hand that tried to be neither clerkly nor feminine. Figures that balanced like a practiced lie. Inside, a burnt scrap of Eleanor's writing, transfer to cover O/D, and a note, "Settle this and spare the girl." G. The G had been drawn, then darkened to resemble a V. "This is not George's work," Miss Marple said. "He pins. He does not stitch." They found Kitty curled on her bed, hiding from the doorway. "I fetched the bottle," she whispered. "He told me to be quick. He said labels only frighten girls. He said our family owed him, for Uncle's doctor." "People who speak of gratitude," Miss Marple said gently, "mean gratitude to themselves." Kitty's voice steadied. "I slipped ticket 217 to you because I knew the bottle was wrong." "Brave and clever," Miss Marple said. "Frightened, which is sometimes better." Night fell clear and cold. Patterns sharpened, order insisted upon, charity used as a leash, unsigned messages, objects fetched and returned to polish a narrative. The gardener had nearly been gassed to erase memory, not money. At 9:30, Graves arrived. Grim. "Someone has sent Pike a ready-made confession. Sign it and he'll be looked after?" "Then keep him from pens," Miss Marple said, "and find the person who writes in a hand that can look like anyone's, until the letters remember who taught them. Tidy people," she added, glancing at her window where a cufflink once marked the glass, "are never so dangerous as when they think the ending belongs to them." Chapter 8. The Confession That Wrote Itself. Inspector Graves arrived at Miss Marple's cottage looking like a man who had run out of patience before he ran out of night. He laid a folded paper on her table. "Left on Pike's sister's doorstep at dawn," he said, "along with a tin of cocoa. Anonymous advice suggests George sign this, and things will be made easier for him." Miss Marple read the page. It was a neat confession. Too neat. It claimed George Pike fetched the bottle Mrs. Ryves preferred, spilled another in panic at the greenhouse, and begged forgiveness for error and distress. It was humble, orderly, and wrong. "It wants to sound true," Miss Marple said, "more than it wants to be true." Graves nodded. "Does it sound like Pike?" "Not at all. Pike writes like a plow. He carves. He does not glide. And he does not use words like whilst or thereafter. This is a clerk hiding behind good penmanship." She turned the page to the light. There, a watermark, V and D, Vale and District Bank stationery, cut into half sheets as reminders or memo scraps, a banker's habit. "Tidy of him," Miss Marple murmured. "Not clever, tidy." The village loved a confession even more than an arrest, and by noon word had spread that George Pike had spoken his guilt. He had not. But the suggestion saved people from having to think, and so it spread willingly. Miss Marple walked past it all, straight to Dolly Hornbeam, whose needle-sharp eyes saw things cleaner than most. Dolly examined the forged confession beside the copied ledger page from April. "Same hand," she said. "See here, the little flick on the downstroke of H and the crossed sevens. Whoever wrote this has practiced disguising his hand, but he slips back into habit." "Office writing," Miss Marple said. "Sweeping strokes. A man who likes things exact." "And look," Dolly added, "Yi flicked right, not straight down." Same on both pages. Miss Marple thanked her. "Some women gossip," Dolly simply observed. At Mrs. Ryves's house, Miss Marple found ribbon scraps and order. Always order. Mrs. Ryves spoke efficiently. "Poor George. Good men are sometimes misled." "By whom?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Ryves stiffened. "Circumstances." "Strange," said Miss Marple softly. "Circumstances in Marleycombe have very tidy handwriting." A silence settled. Polite, brittle, finished. Inspector Graves summoned Bernard Vale. The banker arrived immaculate, his courtesy edged like a polished blade. Graves held up the confession. "This came from your bank's paper stock." "We supply half sheets for parish use," Vale said smoothly. "That proves nothing." Graves tapped a sentence. "The sevens are crossed. Your habit. My clerk's habit." "And the flourish on R?" Vale's eyes hardened. "You are wasting your time, Inspector." Miss Marple spoke from her quiet corner. "A hand that tries to look like nobody's will eventually look like itself, especially under pressure." Vale left without slamming the door. Too tidy for that, but his composure had bent. By late afternoon, Kitty Pike fell ill, not poisoned but faint from broth Mrs. Ryves had prepared. Mr. Crane smelled the bowl and knew at once. Faint traces of nicotine wash, not deliberate but transferred by a hand that had handled poison and cleaned too quickly. Graves questioned Mrs. Ryves gently. "You washed the pot with a cloth that had been in the greenhouse," he said. "You wiped shelves, then tied ribbons, then ladled broth." Mrs. Ryves went pale. "I was only being tidy." "Tidy," Miss Marple said, "is dangerous when one doesn't know what dirt is." That night Miss Marple visited Agnes Hart. "Mrs. Ryves is not our murderer," she said. "She is a broom." The hand behind her still sweeps. Agnes trembled. "You mean Vale?" "I mean," Miss Marple said, "that loyalty has been weaponized in this village. Fear, too. And someone thinks a confession can write itself." She wrote 2 invitations before bed, one to Vale, one to Mrs. Ryves, and waited. "Tidy liars," she murmured, "always come to finish what they started." Chapter 9. Tea, Paper, and a Tidy Offer. Miss Marple laid her parlor with housewifely exactness. Plain silver, familiar cups, the table innocent of everything except a neat stack of half-sheets, 2 freshly sharpened pencils, a blotter, and beneath it a leaf of transfer paper. Convenience can do the work of ingenuity if one arranges it kindly. At 3, Mrs. Ryves arrived first, brisk as duty. Agnes Hart followed, pale and composed. Bernard Vale came last with rehearsed patience and a faultless coat. His cane leaned against the wall like a minor official. Miss Marple poured tea and spoke of choir times, the post, and Weather's insults to roses. Men who live by order relax under domestic small talk. Only after second cups did she turn, mildly, to business. "There is a parish awkwardness," she said. "The relief fund ledger is untidy. We would all be happier if matter and murmurs were both settled, quietly." Silence aligned itself. Mrs. Ryves sat straighter. Agnes looked down. Vale did not move at all. "If sums were run from one pot to another," Miss Marple continued, "and if a lady meant to complain, and if her passing spared embarrassment but left the nuisance of missing papers, Then a receipt for monies restored would comfort everyone. She slid a half sheet toward Vale, voice mild as milk. If you would write the figure and month, Mr. Vale, Mrs. Ryves will countersign for the treasurer, and Miss Hart will supply the date Mrs. Whitcombe intended. Tidy men prefer to command the narrative. Vale took up a pencil. He wrote as clerks do when they believe themselves unseen. Across 7. A Y flicked right, the tick downstroke of H. He added, to cover O/D for parish account. Reaching for the second pencil to initial, he let the first roll. It kissed the blotter, leaving its ghost on the transfer paper beneath. Mrs. Ryves obediently signed. Agnes supplied the date. The page looked decent and restorative. Vale sat back with the air of a man who has performed a distasteful propriety for lesser minds. When he reached for his cane, his cuff brushed the blotter, impressing the faint oval of a cufflink, a crest with a tiny nick. When they had gone with polite murmurs, Miss Marple lifted the blotter. The transfer paper had worked beautifully. Names, figures, strokes, clear as if written twice by a dutiful ghost. She placed the sheet in her workbox and sent for Inspector Graves. He studied the copy. It ties him to the shortfall, he said, not to murder. No, Miss Marple agreed, but it proves motive, habit, and that he will write again when invited to tidy an awkwardness. Do not pull the rope yet. Someone still believes herself the broom Mrs. Ryves, Graves said. Watch her hands, Miss Marple replied, and ask Agnes, publicly, tomorrow, at opening to fetch Miss Whitcombe's papers, now the account is rectified. Fear keeps appointments. Morning brought habit back to the bank, clock tick, polished brass, air of regularity. Agnes entered like a woman approaching confession. Miss Marple sat in the corner with a neat parcel, memorial items for Miss Whitcombe's brother. Graves loitered with the indifference of exact men. Vale appeared civil, unsuspecting. Agnes, voice trained not to trouble, asked for Eleanor's correspondence and relief fund papers, now that matters are in order. For an instant the polish dropped, annoyance, and returned. Of course, he said, taking a key. Keys tell their truth without speeches. He went to the second drawer where awkward papers sleep. The drawer resisted a fraction. On the blotter lay last night's cufflink. It had shifted and caught the corner of a half-sheet. Vale flicked it aside, an irritated, human motion, and the paper lifted like a whisper. Both Graves and Miss Marple saw it. Vale made the tidy man's mistake. He shut the drawer too fast. Tomorrow, he said smoothly. The files are being made neat. Today will do, Graves answered. Agnes lifted her chin. Mr. Vale, she said quietly. Eleanor wrote to the solicitor because she learned not to trust keys in other men's waistcoats. Please give me her letters. Vale calculated roots, bluster, charm, postponement, and reached, as always, for order. Graves, already reaching for his pocket, felt the transfer copy and the impressed oval that matched the cufflink's nick. Paper that shy witness had learned to speak. Tidiness, that favorite alibi, had learned to testify. Miss Marple let out the breath she'd held since the key appeared. Inspector, she said gently, perhaps you would like to ask Mr. Vale about paper, pencils, and the afternoon Mrs. Whitcombe died. Iyun Chapter 10, The Afternoon Account. The bank's back office, usually a sanctuary of orderly sums and ledgers, felt smaller with Inspector Graves inside it. Bernard Vale stood behind his desk, like a man relying on furniture for authority. The incriminating cufflink lay on the blotter between them, innocently bright. Agnes Hart sat stiffly in the visitor's chair, hands clenched. Miss Marple waited in the corner, quiet, precise, unavoidable. Graves began with calm precision. Mr. Vale, where were you at 2 o'clock on the afternoon of the gala, when Mrs. Whitcombe took the dais? Vale clasped his hands. To the left, near Mrs. Ryves's stall. I had just approved the reserve list with the vicar. I applauded the total. I spoke to no one of consequence. Music boy Ernie Fellows saw a silver cufflink catch the sun as a paper crossed the raffle table, Graves said. Your cufflink has that habit. Half the county wears them, Vale said mildly. Not with a nick in the crest, Miss Marple said pleasantly. Vale's gaze flickered, once, to the cufflink on the desk. Then he smiled. You attend to trifles, Miss Marple? Murders are done with them, she replied. Graves placed a sheet before Vale, the transfer copy Miss Marple had taken earlier. You wrote this in Miss Marple's parlor. The same crossed sevens, the same flick on the Y in Pike's forged confession. On your bank's paper. Convenient. My clerk cut the paper, Vale replied. You may interview him. We will, Graves said. After you explain why French polish from your cane ferrule appeared on a vestry window, a greenhouse heater, and Miss Marple's side table. Vale gave a short laugh. Seen purchasing polish is not evidence. It is when the same polish sits on the poisoned bottle stopper, Graves said. Vale stiffened but did not answer. Miss Marple leaned forward. You mentioned a bottle, she said softly. How curious. No one spoke of a bottle until after the doctor arrived. He froze a fraction too long. You sent Kitty Pike back to that cupboard before Eleanor's body was carried away, Miss Marple continued. You sent George Pike later, when Mrs. Ryves wasn't looking. Your tidying began before anyone thought of poison. You are making romance, Vale snapped. Romance does not leave transfer copies, Graves said. Agnes Hart spoke suddenly. He passed Eleanor a folded paper. I saw it. She looked afraid. A paper, Graves repeated. A message. A threat. And then, convenient collapse, Vale's voice thinned. Circumstantial. Graves stepped aside as a constable entered with a lab report. The stopper from the gala, Graves read, bears French shellac polish from St. Aldhelm's upholstery, the same batch as on your cane. Silence thickened. Vale did not deny it. Mrs. Ryves appeared at the doorway, trembling with righteousness. Mr. Vale has served this parish. He also borrowed your pantry key, Miss Marple interrupted gently, and used your cupboards to hide forgery. Mrs. Ryves stared at Vale, realization dawning like illness. Graves straightened. Bernard Vale, I am arresting you for the murder of Eleanor Whitcombe and offenses relating to the relief fund. Vale's face hardened to marble. He did not struggle as the cuffs were fastened. You arrest a man respected by every subscription list in the county, he said. Your old lady plays games. Your vicar is weak. Your treasurer blind. Your constable slow. And your hand, Graves said, writes confessions in other people's names. He was led out past staring faces and the tick of the lobby clock. Miss Marple turned to Graves. It isn't over. No? He will claim he never meant to kill. He will blame Pike, and someone else still sweeps his tracks. Mrs. Ryves? She'll need watching, Miss Marple said. She mistook obedience for goodness and nearly killed a girl with tidiness. Agnes stepped closer. Will they ask me to speak? Yes, Miss Marple said. You will tell them how he arranged Eleanor's dignity, how he used her pride to make her lift the poisoned bottle herself. Graves locked Vale's desk drawer. We'll find the letter. The stubs. Something. The last truth won't be in his desk, Miss Marple said. It will be in his story. Tidy men always tell the same story twice. On the second telling, they correct themselves. Outside, Marleycombe began to breathe again, but too soon. In tidy towns, the last danger always comes after the first arrest. Chapter 11. The last loose thread. Rain came at last to Marleycombe, soft and straight, as if the sky were tired of watching. But rain only darkens footprints. It does not wash motives clean. Inspector Graves believed the case nearly finished. Bernard Vale, or Bernard Hale, as they would soon learn, waited under guard in Oakshire. The forged confession, the stolen ledgers, the varnish traces, the stopper, everything pointed to him. And yet Miss Marple did not resume her knitting. One thread still hung loose. Vale had not handed the poisoned bottle to Eleanor Whitcombe. That last act had required someone closer. Miss Marple walked through the rain to the beeches. Agnes Hart admitted her silently. The house still wore Eleanor Whitcombe's rigid order, now more like a tomb than a home. "You expected me?" Miss Marple said gently. Agnes didn't pretend otherwise. "Because something doesn't fit." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "Vale arranged the forgery, hid the shortfall, and set the crime in motion. But someone in this house placed the poisoned stopper onto the salts bottle." Agnes's voice faltered. "Kitty fetched the bottle, but she didn't choose it." "No," Miss Marple said. "She only obeyed." Agnes stood very still. "You know, I know you were afraid," Miss Marple said. "Afraid of Vale." Agnes closed her eyes. "He said it was harmless. He said it would only frighten Eleanor. That she would stop asking questions if she thought her heart was weak." Miss Marple waited. Agnes whispered, "He gave me the stopper." "Just the stopper. I changed it the morning of the gala, before Eleanor came down. He said she would faint, only faint." "But she died," Miss Marple finished softly. Agnes nodded, tears in her voice. "By the time I realized, it was too late. Kitty brought it to her, and I couldn't stop it." "You didn't poison Eleanor," Miss Marple said gently, "but you helped the lie along. Vale frightened you into obedience." Agnes trembled. "He said Eleanor had found something old. He said people would be ruined if she spoke." Miss Marple's expression sharpened. "Did he say who?" Agnes shook her head. "He never said names." "Then I must find that last name," Miss Marple said, rising. "The thread is nearly pulled free." She found Graves at the bank, sorting Vale's seized papers. Just as she entered, Graves pulled out a sealed envelope marked in Eleanor Whitcombe's hand, "To be opened only in the event of my death." Inside lay a single page, greater than, "If anything befalls me, look not at my present but my past." A debt was hidden beneath charity. The truth lies with the one who married money and rose upon it. The truth remains in the name he abandoned. Graves unfolded a second document from the envelope, a marriage certificate. Bernard Victor Hale, not Vale. "He changed his name," Graves muttered. "Rebuilt himself." Miss Marple turned the document over. A faded note clung to the back. "Greater than Hale ruined a man and buried the proof. Find the partner he betrayed." Graves looked up sharply. "Partner?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Someone he swindled long ago. Someone who lost everything and stayed in Marleycombe. Someone who works with his hands and says little Graves breathed the name. Crane." They found Mr. Crane in the rain, mending a greenhouse frame, quiet as ever. "Evening," he said. "Come to get wet with me?" "You knew him as Bernard Hale," Miss Marple said. Crane's eyes held years of silence. "I knew him before he discovered polish. You were partners," she said. "A nursery business. He forged your name on a loan, fled with your money, left you ruined." Crane didn't deny it. "My wife died thinking I'd failed her." Graves watched him steadily. "Did you kill Eleanor Whitcombe?" "No." Crane's answer held the hard weight of truth. "But I knew someone would die when Bernard Hale came back wearing a new name." Miss Marple stepped closer. "Then why keep silent?" Because revenge, said Crane quietly, costs more than most people can pay. Graves frowned. If it isn't over, who's still in danger? Crane met Miss Marple's eyes. He already knew she knew. The one still holding the broom, he said. Miss Marple's face grew grave. Yes, she whispered, Mrs. Ryves. And now that Vale had fallen, she would do anything to clean up what remained. The last loose thread had begun to tighten. Chapter 12. The final sweep, approximately 1,000 words. Night had settled over Marleycombe with the slow weight of a decision not yet made. A thin wind moved along the lanes like something searching, and the village, sensing danger without quite knowing why, had drawn in upon itself. Curtains closed early. Lamps burned late. Doors were locked. But one house at the edge of the green remained awake. Miss Marple's. She sat in her parlor, waiting. The clock on the mantel ticked in polite, patient rhythm. On the small table beside her lay 3 things. Ticket 217. The forged confession. The transfer copy of Bernard Vale's handwriting. Beside them was a 4th object, a tidy little notebook in a brown cover. Mrs. Ryves's notebook. She had left it behind earlier that afternoon in Miss Marple's hall table, though Miss Marple suspected it had been left there on purpose. That notebook had confirmed what the village still refused to see. Mrs. Penelope Ryves had not only helped Bernard Vale cover his fraud, she had helped execute his plan. Not willingly at first, she had been a loyal woman, a woman who believed that duty polished away wrongdoing. But Vale knew her weakness. She believed order must be maintained at all costs. So he fed her reasons, respectability, community, charity, and she had obeyed. In the end, she had obeyed too well. She had sent Kitty to fetch the bottle. She had sent Pike to fetch what she thought were ledgers. She had cleaned and tidied the evidence Vale could not reach. She had protected Vale because she believed protecting appearances was protecting the village. But now Vale had fallen, and people like Mrs. Ryves do not survive without the person giving the orders. Someone approached the gate outside. The knight did not flinch at the footsteps. Miss Marple merely folded her hands in her lap. A knock sounded. 3 taps, brisk and composed, exactly the way Mrs. Ryves would knock. "Come in," Miss Marple called. The door opened. Mrs. Ryves entered, hat and coat on, as if she were on her way to a meeting, calm, perfectly in control. "Good evening, Miss Marple," she said pleasantly. "Forgive the hour." "Not at all," Miss Marple replied. "I've been expecting you." Mrs. Ryves's gaze flicked to the notebook on the table. "I see you found my book." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "or rather, you wished it to be found." Mrs. Ryves did not deny it. She walked to the window, glancing through the lace curtain. "Inspector Graves is still at the bank, I take it." "For now," Miss Marple said, "but he will come here soon." He already knows Bernard Vale had a partner in crime. It will not take long for him to discover who carried out Vale's instructions. Mrs. Ryves looked back, eyes bright, too bright. "Then I must speak before he arrives." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, it is time. The last story." Mrs. Ryves stood straighter. "Very well," she said. "Then let us be plain. Yes, I helped Bernard Vale, but I did not know he meant murder." Not at first. Miss Marple remained silent. Mrs. Ryves went on, voice steady but trembling at the edges. "He came to me months ago, told me the relief fund had suffered a misunderstanding. Money moved temporarily. He assured me it would be restored. And you believed him," Miss Marple said. Mrs. Ryves pressed her lips together. "It wasn't a question of belief. It was a question of protecting what was good. I have given 20 years to village committees, charities, school rosters. Good work should not be ruined by an untidy story. And Eleanor Whitcombe discovered the truth, Miss Marple said. Mrs. Ryves nodded. She said she would expose him. She said she would march straight to the district journal. She would have destroyed everything. Everything the relief fund had done, every good work. I could not allow that. Miss Marple looked at her steadily. So you agreed to frighten her? Yes, Mrs. Ryves whispered. Vale said he had something, a strong-smelling draft, that would make her faint, just enough to stop her campaign. No harm, he said. Only fear. Her voice cracked. I swear, he said it would only frighten her. Yet you gave Kitty the poisoned bottle. I didn't know, Mrs. Ryves cried. He swapped it. He must have swapped it. I trusted him. And suddenly, she was dead. And you covered it, Miss Marple said, not accusing, merely completing the thought. Yes, Mrs. Ryves said, voice dull now. I cleaned. I moved things. I told George Pike what to fetch. I did whatever Bernard asked, because I thought keeping order was righteousness. And when Vale was arrested, Miss Marple asked quietly, did you consider confessing? Mrs. Ryves took a breath that seemed to hollow her. I am not afraid of consequences, Miss Marple. But neither am I a fool. I know what people will say. They will think me evil. I am not. I only ever did what seemed necessary. Miss Marple's voice was very quiet. Necessary for whom? Mrs. Ryves closed her eyes. The dangerous kind. When she opened them, something had changed. Resolve hardened. Her hand reached into her handbag. Miss Marple did not look surprised. You brought a weapon. A small one, Mrs. Ryves said. A kitchen knife, very tidy. No noise. Miss Marple did not rise from her chair. Penelope, she said gently, if you kill me now, Graves will know it was you. And if you don't, your story still ends tonight. Mrs. Ryves's voice was almost pleading. I cannot allow you to speak. Not now. Not when order can still be kept. Vale will be convicted. The parish will survive. No one else needs to know what I did. Oh, but they do, Miss Marple said softly. Because murderers are not only those who kill, they are also those who teach others to obey without question. The knife wavered. Mrs. Ryves's face twisted. Grief, panic, fury, shame. Put it down, Miss Marple said. Penelope, you must see it now. You were never protecting Marleycombe. You were protecting men like Vale from consequences. Mrs. Ryves's hand shook, trembled, then she broke. The knife dropped into her lap. She sagged back in the chair, sobbing without sound. Inspector Graves arrives. Inspector Graves arrived minutes later. He stood in the doorway, saying nothing as he took in the scene. Miss Marple, calm, Mrs. Ryves undone, the notebook on the table. Is it over? He asked quietly. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. She will tell you everything. Graves looked at Mrs. Ryves. There was no triumph in his face, only understanding and a grave, quiet sorrow. Mrs. Ryves, he said gently, you will come with me now. She did not resist. She stood, straightened her coat, folded her grief into dignity once more. Before she left, she looked back at Miss Marple. Was I wicked? She asked, not defiant. Lost. Miss Marple shook her head. No, just dangerous, she said. The most dangerous kind, those who mistake obedience for goodness. Mrs. Ryves closed her eyes. Then she went with Graves into the night. Epilogue. The next morning, Marleycombe was reborn, not cheerful, but honest. George Pike was released. Kitty Pike returned home. Agnes Hart was asked to stay on at the Beeches as companion to Eleanor's brother when he arrived. Bernard Hale, would face trial. Mrs. Ryves would be tried too, but she would be spoken of, in time, with pity rather than hatred. As for Miss Marple, she walked through the village that had begun knitting itself together again, and thought, as she often did, how strange people are. We fear monsters, she reflected, but they are easy to see. It is the tidy ones you must beware of, the ones who sweep evil under the rug and call the room clean. She paused at her gate, listening to the village mourning. Life had resumed, and that, she decided, was justice enough.